to be chill, fun, and listy. I'm going to tell you 10 things I think you might not know about insulin resistance, or at least might not fully appreciate. So number 1, insulin resistance is the strongest metabolic risk factor for heart disease. It blows LDL out of the water and is much more important even than things like HDL or triglycerides, although having high triglycerides and low HDL predicts you'll be insulin resistant. So they're kind of a proxy for insulin resistance. But anyway, studies published, including one in JAMA Cardiology on January 20th, 2021, show that insulin resistance is the most important risk factor for heart disease. In that study I just mentioned, they showed that lipoprotein insulin resistance, which is a lab test you can get, was the strongest metabolic risk factor for heart disease. And the strongest clinical risk factor was diabetes, type 2 diabetes, which of course is defined by being a state of high insulin resistance. So, first on the list is insulin resistance is the most important risk factor, the strongest risk factor for coronary heart disease. Item number 2 on the list is that about 10 to 25% of people who are obese are actually insulin sensitive because they store very little visceral fat. So different people store fat in different places. Some store more subcutaneous, that's the type under your skin. Some store more visceral, that's the stuff in your gut. And that's really the unhealthy fat. So some people, lucky people, they're called metabolically healthy obese, or MHO. And it's because they tend to store very little visceral fat and more subcutaneous. Interestingly, you can actually recapitulate this phenotype in mice by overexpressing the GLUT4 transporter, specifically in subcutaneous fat tissue, and these mice become enormously fat. But they remain totally metabolically healthy. So this goes to the point that insulin sensitivity is much more important than BMI alone. Again, weight and BMI, if you're overweight, you're more likely to be insulin resistant, but it's not for sure. Again, it's a proxy for being insulin resistant or insulin sensitive. But it's insulin resistance that's at the core of whether you're healthy or unhealthy. Number 3 on the list is exercise increases muscle insulin sensitivity for up to 48 hours. It does so in a few different ways. In fact, it actually increases muscle's receptivity to glucose independent of insulin. And that's because exercise itself, the muscle contractions, activate this protein called TBC1D4, which causes glucose transporters, I should say, to go to the sarcolemma, the muscle cell membrane, so you can take up glucose. But this same pathway actually primes that protein to be more receptive to insulin. So not only are you more receptive to glucose independent of insulin, but then for the next 48 hours, you're hypersensitive to insulin, which is a good thing because of the way this protein is activated. It has to do with the backroad pathway, the muscle contraction, phosphorylating this TBC1D4 on a serine 704 residue, which is different than the AKT pathway. I'm getting jargony here, but it's interesting. You can check that out. That was in a review about insulin and adipocyte biology that was recently published in Cell. I'll link it in the show notes. Anyway, exercise increases muscle insulin sensitivity for 48 hours. That's pretty cool. That was point 3. Point 4, insulin resistance blunts the thermic effect of food. So about 10% of the calories you burn in a day come from or are associated with the food you consume. So if you're on a 2,000 calorie diet, that's about 200 calories coming from the thermic effect of food. But interestingly, if you're insulin resistant, you burn fewer calories after eating than someone who's insulin sensitive. And this has to do with the fact that insulin is supposed to stimulate a pathway that cleaves this protein TUG. TUG tethers glucose transporters inside of cells, and when it gets cut, the glucose transporters go to the cell surface to suck up glucose. But recent research published March 8th, 2021 in Nature show that the cleavage product of this TUG protein goes into the nucleus of cells and activates transcriptional regulators, PPAR gamma and PGC1 alpha, the master regulator of mitochondrial biogenesis, and this promotes thermogenesis, the thermic effect of food. But if you're insulin resistant, you can't properly activate this pathway. So when you eat, you're going to burn fewer calories as a result of eating. So that's kind of a bummer. If you're insulin resistant, hopefully you're not. That's number 4 on the list. Insulin resistance blunts the thermic effect of food. Number 5 on the list is insulin resistance is associated with lower levels of vitamin C in the blood. Vitamin C is a dietary antioxidant, and this is probably because insulin resistance itself leads to oxidative stress, and so you're going to burn through the vitamin C very quickly. In addition, insulin resistance, a lot of the times, goes hand in hand with higher carbohydrate diets, and carbohydrates are going to block vitamin C uptake. But anyway, insulin resistance is associated with lower vitamin C levels in the blood. All right, 6 on the list is having insulin resistance in the brain predicts you won't be able to keep weight off, and that you'll lose, you won't lose, you'll store more harmful visceral fat, i.e. the inflammatory beer gut fat that you really don't want. So this was a study published in Nature Communications by Coleman et al. Last year in 2020. And what they showed is that people who had insulin resistance in the brain, not only were they less able to keep weight off and regained weight after 24 months and 9 years, but that independent of BMI, they preferentially stored visceral fat. And this kind of makes sense if you think about the brain. The hypothalamus is the master regulator of the body's hormonal systems, which is going to control where you partition fat. And so if you're insulin resistant there, you're messed up there, your body's not going to have a good sense of where it makes sense to put fat. Or sorry, not put fat, put calories. So they'll be less likely to put it into muscle, more likely to put it into bad fat, visceral fat. And that's exactly what they showed in this paper. That insulin resistance in the hypothalamus predicts people will gain back weight more easily, and they'll preferentially gain visceral fat, which you really don't want. All right, number 8 on the list. The leading genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, it's a gene variant called ApoE4. About 20 to 25% of people carry this risk factor, and it itself independently can contribute to a little bit of insulin resistance. I think this was Zhao et al., published in 2017. I think it was the journal Neuron. It was some publication in Cell, and what they showed was that the ApoE4 protein that's coded for the ApoE4, coded by the ApoE4 gene, it traps insulin receptors inside endosomes and cells so they can't get to the surface, and this causes some degree of insulin resistance. Now, tangentially, there is other data to suggest that ketogenic diets actually might improve endosomal functioning. This is a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down now, but if you're really interested in it, you can become a member of the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners and watch my 2-hour lecture on the subject, or come to the Low Carb All-Stars Conference this June 19th and 20th. You can get tickets for that now, where I'll be talking about endosomes as well. But anyway, this risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, is what I'm trying to say, contributes to insulin resistance. And Alzheimer's disease, not coincidentally, is characterized by insulin resistance, sometimes known as a type 3 diabetes. So it links the genetic risk factor, again, to insulin resistance and another metabolic dysfunction, Alzheimer's disease. Now, not to be doom and gloom, just because you have ApoE4 doesn't mean your brain's going to be insulin resistant and you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. It's more complicated than that. In that study I referenced, they showed that obesogenic diets really exacerbate the effect of ApoE4 on insulin resistance. So, if you're ApoE4, which I happen to be, I think, again, this is a topic for another time, but that a ketogenic diet, or at least cyclic keto, is the best way to improve your insulin resistance in the brain and capitalize on your metabolic advantages and disadvantages to reduce cognitive decline. But I'm going on about number 8 just because it's a topic that I really love. Let's go on to number 9 on this list. Lower carb diets have been shown to effectively and sustainably reverse type 2 diabetes, the most extreme form of insulin resistance, in multiple long-term trials. Maybe this isn't a surprise to you, but it needed to get on the list because if you haven't seen the Virta 1-year and 2-year data, the studies coming out by Dr. David Unwin in the UK showing that therapeutic carbohydrate reduction can sustainably reverse type 2 diabetes, so get HbA1c below 5.7%. 5.7% is the threshold for prediabetes, and get people off medications. It's been shown to do this with over 50% efficacy, which is well over 11-fold the efficacy of standard of care. And in terms of adherence, when people have support, at least in the Verta trial, adherence is the same to standard of care as it is to the diet. People can adhere to this diet, and it can effectively reverse type 2 diabetes. That's really important. Maybe it's not a surprise to you, but it's really important. Number 10 on the list. 1 in 10 Americans currently has full-blown diabetes. 1 in 3 has prediabetes or diabetes, and by mid-century, it's projected that 1 in 3 Americans will have full-blown diabetes. So look to your left, look to your right. One of those people, or you, will have diabetes if we don't do anything. Have diabetes by mid-century. And by 2050, 700 million people worldwide could have diabetes globally. That's crazy, 700 million. And those are just numbers in terms of the human burden. You bring in the economic costs and it just becomes unsustainable. Currently, America is spending 24% of its healthcare dollars, $1 billion per day, on diabetes. Think about what that number will become if we continue on this trajectory. Anyway, I hope that was fun and loose. You learned something. I know I went off on a couple of tangents, but you can always rewatch. So that was 10 things you might not know or might not fully appreciate about insulin resistance.